So we'll now turn to our panel to go through their thoughts on this decision aid, maybe some reaction with how Hector and his team applied the decision aid, and thoughts on, so what does this mean in terms of knowing if the study is good enough? So Jessica? Should I give my you can stay there if you, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that was actually a very good example for some of the things that I wanted to discuss. So I actually had slides that...
Oh, okay. In that case, you can go if you want to.
So I have just a couple slides. So I wanted to talk about kind of what's known and what remains. So when I looked at the decision aid, what immediately struck me is that we actually know a little bit more about how to do a good observational study than I think the decision aid really lets on. And I think Hector's study was a very good example of kind of doing some of those additional things that we know can help us believe in the validity of a study. And so it can be very hard to actually, in a decision aid format, try to tell people exactly what to do, right? So this is the section where we actually are trying to tell people how to do your study design, how to do your analysis, and that's a very hard task because for any given clinical question, the exact right methods to use are going to vary, of course, as we said yesterday. It depends, but I think that we can give some people some suggestions about what things have worked well in the past, and we can also tell people, some of the things that we know they definitely should not do because we know that they lead to bias, and we've seen that over and over and over again, that these are some of the common mistakes that people make when they're designing an observational study from real-world evidence. So we actually summarized some of our thinking on these topics in a paper that we published last year with my colleague Sebastian Schneeweiss. So some of these suggestions for things that have worked well in the past are, for example, a new user design. So this is, of course, not going to be the right design for every clinical question, for every data source, but we have enough experience with it now that we know it solves a lot of problems, and so we could think about putting some suggestions like this right in the decision aid to get people thinking about some useful designs. Other useful suggestions are active comparators, particularly active comparators used with a similar treatment modality at a similar disease stage, outcomes measured with high specificity, data sources with good longitudinal exposure measurement. I know some of this was suggested yesterday, but we also know, as David talked about in the introduction to the decision aid, we know that propensity scores often work well. Again, they're not the answer to every question, but there's something that I think is useful for investigators to be thinking about. And then extensive sensitivity analyses, and so that's where I think Hector's paper really gives us, good examples of two different kinds. One is to use control outcomes or control exposures, but also to think about incorporating external data, even if it's only measured on a subsample in your study. And so here's an example that I worked on with some of my colleagues where we were looking at different diabetes medications compared to linagliptin. The covariates that you see here in the table were not measured in the main claims database. These were incorporated from a linked EHR, and they were only available on a small subset of the study. But I think it still told us a lot in terms of how much balance we were able to achieve with propensity score matching. So in this table, this is already matched on propensity score using the claims, the covariates measured in claims. And you can see, we have three different treatment groups, or three different comparator groups here. And, based on this evaluation, we can see that linagliptin was much better at being balanced against other DPP-4 inhibitors versus the other treatment groups that were considered. So those are some suggestions of things that we can think about to do proactively in our study. But there's also several things that we know people should not be doing. Reverse causation, immortal time bias, adjusting for causal intermediaries, and depletion of susceptibles. And so this doesn't include that entire list, but this is another study that I worked on that's not published yet, but I worked on it with some of my colleagues where we did a literature review of all of the papers that we could find that were published looking at diabetes medications and cancer outcomes. And what you can see is that, really avoidable mistakes that we know are going to, lead to serious bias in your study, like immortal person time, showed up again and again and again across the literature. And so we could think about, incorporating some of those, thou shalt not type commandments into the decision aid. So before I end, I just wanted to touch on a project that I'm working on now that I think gets to Greg's question a little bit about sort of how do we know whether or not an observational study is good enough, right? This is the ultimate question that we want to know when we begin a new study. Is this study going to give us valid results? Is this study going to give us reliable results that we believe in? Because if we can't, say with pretty high confidence that it's going to work, why are we wasting our time? And so I'm leading, along with Sebastian Schneeweiss, a project working very closely with people at FDA, including many people in this room, looking at replicating randomized trials in real-world evidence data sources. And the idea behind this is not just to replicate the randomized trial. The idea is that if we can show that across a whole range of clinical questions, we can consistently replicate the results from randomized trials in real-world evidence, then that gives us confidence going forward into new clinical questions where a randomized trial will never be conducted. It gives us confidence that actually we are getting the same results that we would get if we were to do a randomized trial. And so this is kind of the overview of the process, right? So we're at the point now where we have selected 30 randomized trials that we plan to replicate. So that's kind of our end that we're planning to come up with 30 replications. We're setting up the kind of our platform in order to do the replications, and then in the end, we will reproduce the randomized trials with real-world data to the extent that we can. Of course, there are some inclusion/exclusion criteria that we won't be able to perfectly mimic, but to the extent that we can, we will replicate the RCTs and then compare the results against. Compare the results against the randomized controlled trials. And so just a little bit about our process, because I think it nicely mirrors what's in the decision aid. The first step is, really choosing the 30 trials that we plan to replicate, or, another way is saying, is this even an appropriate setting where we should be trying to do a real-world evidence study, and is the data quality fit for purpose? If we make it to that stage, then maybe that trial makes it into our list of 30. Then we're going to draft a statistical analysis plan. Once we've drafted our statistical analysis plan, we go on and actually do some initial feasibility analyses to again look at how likely is it that this study will result in reliable results. So looking at the power, looking at the balance of the measured covariates, to at least show that this is a place where we think we can be successful with real-world data. At that point, if we decide that we're ready to go through, we register our study and we register our protocol, so we are explicit about exactly what analyses we plan to do before we do any comparative analyses whatsoever. And at that point, then we move into this box where we are actually doing analyses, implementing the study, sharing results with our partners at FDA, and then they can actually go in and ask to change things, ask to see additional data. And I think, this is sort of the process that we're taking for our replication project, but I think it's also potentially a model for the type of implementation process that could be used if real-world evidence was really going to inform policy here. So thanks.